ordain bishops. And so Chris thought that it was saying, and it could say that, so it wasn't unreasonable what he was saying, because as a matter of fact, when we looked at it last week, there's plenty of verses that lend itself to this idea, that what it's saying is that the bishops are the elders at the same time. Not only are the elders the bishops, but the bishops are the elders. And so he was thinking that what Paul was telling Titus was to ordain the elders, who are the bishops. And so that made sense in this context. I can see how you can draw that out of there. So after I explained that the elders, not all the elders were bishops, because that's what I was teaching, you take the pool of elders and then you pull your bishops out of that pool, right? So he had a different understanding of what this was saying than I did. So I owed it to him to explain to him why I believed what I believed. But at the same time, I left myself open to being corrected on that, if in fact we could find enough scripture to support that. Now his viewpoint obviously was a little narrower in scope than mine. Mine is you have elders, and then there's a subset of elders, which is bishops, and even deacons, even another subset if you wanted to push it. But where he was saying elders were only bishops. And so there are some consequences to that understanding, because there's such verses like in James where it says to call the elders. That would mean only call the pastors to anoint you with oil, if indeed the bishops were the only elders in the church. When it says rebuke not an elder, that means you can only not rebuke pastors, but you can go ahead and rebuke Donald. So there are some consequences to a narrowing of the scope of that definition of elders. So we started looking at elders in the New Testament here, and we started in the book of Acts, because everything before the book of Acts, although it is profitable, we would have been there forever. I mean, this would have been a forever study if you were going to look at it like that. And I'm going to look at a couple in the book of Acts that do indeed have nothing to do with the church properly, literally, but that application can be made with the definition drawn from it. And so last week we looked, starting in the book of Acts, and we went all the way up to the end of the book of Acts, and we were just about to get into Romans. We might even started to look at Romans, but we didn't get any further than that, and we just used too much time, so we had to stop. So we finished looking at these texts here, and I can't redo it, even though none of it got recorded, but I can't redo it. But there were texts such as, for example, Acts chapter 20. Now, Acts chapter 20 is where, in verse number 17, Paul is on his third missionary journey, headed to Jerusalem right before he gets arrested. On his way back, swinging across the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, south of Ephesus, he stops at this place called Miletus in verse number 17, and he sent to Ephesus and called the elders of the church. And then he gives them this charge. He's basically saying goodbye. And then in verse number 28, he tells these elders, take heed therefore unto yourselves and to all the flock over which the Holy Ghost hath made you overseers, to feed the church of God, which he hath purchased with his own blood. And you see there that these elders were those that were made overseers. And that's what a bishop is, an overseer. That's what the word means, an overseer. So these elders in particular were the bishops in Ephesus. I suppose I should write a little list here on the board. I've got one in front of me, but it might help you to see what I'm thinking here, and how you can categorize things and work them through in your study, so that you can start a process of elimination or so forth in looking at a word. And what we're trying to figure out what elders are, and bishops has some evidence that elders are bishops. In Acts chapter 20, in verse 28, is one of those places to where the elders are bishops. It's clear. And he tells them to feed the flock of God. Another place where it's clear that they're bishops is 1 Peter chapter 5. That's where we're headed in on Sunday. We're going to be right in this thing on Sunday. This will be the text he'll be in. I mean, I don't know what he's going to preach, but this is the text we're headed in now because we just finished chapter 4. I think we finished it. So we're studying chapter 5, right? Yeah, that's where I'm at. Verse 1. 5 verse 1. 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 1. I'm at chapter 5 verse 1. The elders which are among you I exhort, who am also an elder, and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. Now look at how close this is in terminology to Acts chapter 20 and verse 28. Feed the flock of God. That's exactly what he said in Acts chapter 20, 28. Take heed therefore unto yourselves and to all the flock, to feed the church of God. That's what's said in Acts 20. It's very similar language here. Feed the flock, 1 Peter 5:2. Feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the what? Oversight. So these are overseers here he's talking to. These first couple verses, these are bishops. He's telling them to take the oversight thereof, of that flock of God, which is the church. Feed the flock of God, which is among you, taking the oversight thereof. So 1 Peter 5, verses 1 and 2 would also lend itself to the idea that the elders are bishops. There's a couple other ones, but they're not as concrete as these two. When we went through the book of Acts, there were some where there was a little overlap. Acts chapter 15, you've seen that there with James and the elders and the brethren, and there were different classifications mentioned there, but a little bit of argument can be made from different directions there. But these are ironclad. For sure, bishops are elders. That's a fact. Bishops are elders. But the question at hand is, are all elders bishops? For sure, bishops are elders, but are those the only elders there are in the church? See, this is what we're trying to figure out, okay? I'll give you another category to look at, which is older men. Just simply older men. Are there any verses that define elders as just the older men of the church? Not those that hold an office, but just the older men of the church. Are there any verses in the Scripture that can show that an elder can be an elder and not a bishop at the same time? Well, we've got several verses that'll fit this description here. Right. And we never got to 1 Timothy, so we'll look at that one first. 1 Timothy 5:1. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse number 1. Now remember, he already went through chapter 3, which was the qualifications of a bishop and a deacon. And here in chapter 5, and there's an important verse here just previously in chapter 4 we're going to look at too a little bit. But anyway, chapter 5 and verse 1 of 1 Timothy. Not 1 Peter, but we're in 1 Timothy now, chapter 5, verse number 1. Now look at this. It says, rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father. Now, let's pretend that the only elders are bishops. And so let's read it like that, see if it makes any sense. Rebuke not a bishop, but entreat him as a father, and the younger men as brethren. Well, the contrast here with the word elder is younger. So the implication is age. It's not office, it's age. Right. Rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father, and the younger men as brethren. So clearly this context here shows an elder as just being an older man. Now, when that starts and all that, that's another argument altogether. I'm not even going to go there. But there is such a thing as an elder man who in this context, there's no idea of this person being a bishop, and you can tell that it's not talking about an office because of verse 2. The elder women as mothers, and the younger as sisters, with all purity. Clearly, this is not talking about office holders. Right. This is just talking about the elder people in the church, just by age. It's not even talking about spirituality. It's just talking about common decency because of the age of, and there's typically there's wisdom that comes with that. It's not always the case, but there was something to that principle of treating your elders with respect. And that is a biblical precept. And you find that right here. So 1 Timothy 5:1 has already broadened the scope of the term for an elder beyond that being restricted to a bishop. So we already see it's more than just bishops. We've got this other class of older men. Hebrews 11:2. Hebrews 11:2. Of course, verse 1, very famous, popular. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it, by faith, by it the elders obtained a good report. Now these aren't elders of a church, because it's looking backwards in history. But then it's going to start talking about Noah and Abraham and David and Jephthah. They're just called elders. Well, they're not bishops. Not all of them were rulers either. So these are just elders in the faith. And so that principle is seen in Hebrews 11:2, that an elder is understood by that term, elder, just by being an older man. In 1 Peter 5, again, we just left there. But if we were to have continued reading on in 1 Peter 5, we read the first two verses. Verse 3, neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being ensamples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd shall appear, ye shall receive a crown of glory that fadeth not away. Of course, you could see when we were talking about the plurality of bishops, and whether a bishop and a pastor were the same guy, you see the word shepherd being correlated to these guys that had oversight, which is what a bishop is. And a shepherd is what a pastor is. And you see the synonymous and the harmony, the synonymous nature of these terms. And we went over that in the plurality of bishops in that study there. But you see that this chief shepherd, when he shall appear, he shall receive a crown of glory that fadeth not away. This crown of glory is also known as a shepherd's crown. One of the rewards that you can get, but a shepherd gets this one by being ensamples to the flock and not being lords over God's heritage. And you see that just as this chief shepherd, there's a chief shepherd, so the pastors of the flock are under shepherds of the shepherd, Jesus Christ. And then look at verse 5. Likewise, just like bishops, those that have the oversight, just like those guys submit to Christ, just like they have to submit to the higher authority in Jesus Christ, likewise, ye younger, submit yourselves unto the elder. Yea, all of you be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility, and humble yourself, and so forth, in the next verse. And you can see that idea of younger and elder, thus terms of age. And that's what we were looking for. So 1 Peter 5:5 would define an elder as just a man that's not a younger man, whatever that is. Like I said, we can argue about what year or how old a person is when they go from younger to older, but that's beside the point. There is such a thing as older men that are not bishops. But bishops are called elders and older men are called elders. Now, what about these guys called deacons? I threw that in there just because they are office holders. And now, while there's no verses where the word elder and deacon are directly connected, if you look at 1 Timothy chapter 3, 1 Timothy chapter 3, I think I can make a compelling case that a deacon is also an elder, although the word isn't used there. But you see the same characteristics in a deacon that you see in a bishop, and a bishop is an elder, right? So I think I can make a compelling case from the scripture that a deacon is also an elder. So in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse number Oops, I'm in 2 Timothy. That's not going to help me. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, you see the qualifications of the bishop, verses 1 through 7. And then verse number 8. Likewise must the deacons be... See now, likewise, just like the bishop needs to have all these qualifications, likewise must the deacons be grave, not double-tongued, not giving much wine, not greedy of filthy lucre, holding the mystery of the faith in a pure conscience. And let these also first be proved. So these are proven people. These are people that have been around enough to be able to be proved. Then let them use the office of a deacon, being found, look at this, blameless. Blameless. Even so must their wives be grave, not slanderous, sober, faithful in all things. Let the deacons be the husbands of one wife, ruling their children and their own houses well. Okay? So you've seen earlier in the chapter that these are, verse 2, a bishop must be blameless, the husband of one wife. You see there's a correlation in the nature of these qualifications of these two office holders. Now the nature of the office is different, but the nature of the qualifications are very closely related. Not only that, if you go back to Titus chapter 1 again, you see where it uses that term elder in verse number 5, where Paul tells Titus to ordain elders. And that says, if any be blameless, the husband of one wife. Well, that's what he just got done telling a deacon he had to be. Blameless, the husband of one wife. So you can see that if in one text, let's say we were reading about leopards, and the description of a leopard is that he has spots and he has fur and that he's got whiskers and he's a cat, and then you start talking about another creature or something, but it doesn't give the name, but it's got whiskers and spots and fur and it's a cat. Well, you can make a case that it's a leopard. And that's what I'm doing with a deacon. You can make a case that they're an elder because of the characteristics and the traits of a deacon match that of an elder, match that of a bishop. And so you can make a compelling case that a deacon is an elder. I put this in a Venn diagram. I know I'm getting kind of nerdy now when it comes to this kind of stuff, but a Venn diagram is like those sets and subsets things that I drew for you before. And if we were to draw a circle for each class that we've got up here, aldermen, bishops, and deacons. Should have put this up on the board here. Just give me my proof text. Okay, this circle is, I'll use an E for this circle, a B for bishop for this circle, and a D for deacon for that circle. Okay, so I can say that elders, now bishops are elders, we gave you these, right? So if these are elders, and I just shade it in, I'm not going to really color it in. All elders are elders, right? All older men are elders. You established that already, just simply by age. All older men are elders. All bishops are elders. So this section here where bishops crosses over into the elder circle gets shaded in because bishops are elders. Now deacons, we made a case that deacons are elders. Okay. Now bishops aren't deacons, so we can't shade in this middle section because there's overlap of deacons and bishops there. Well, there are no bishops that are deacons and there are no deacons that are bishops. So that section remains empty. Now we haven't found any cases where a deacon is not an elder or a bishop is not an elder. So a Venn diagram like this, now it would look better if I had colors because then I could show you a distinction. But in this Venn diagram, basically what I've drawn here, and then I could put all these verses here in the circle or whatever, but you've got them all right there. this Venn diagram is saying that all bishops, because all that exist are in this section. There's nothing over here. It's empty. I didn't shade any of this. If I had shaded this, then I could say some bishops aren't elders. But there aren't any bishops that aren't elders. So that's empty. I can't shade this in because then I would be saying some deacons aren't elders. But I don't have a case for that. So there are no deacons that are not elders. So this Venn diagram shows that all bishops are elders, all deacons are elders, and some elders are bishops, some elders are deacons, and some aren't. Because there are some elders that are not bishops, and there's some elders that are not deacons. Does that make any sense? If I had colors, I would color code these sections differently just so you can see it better from a distance, but that's what a Venn diagram does. So, and we have the scripture texts right here to prove that Venn diagram to be valid. And so a valid case is made that not all elders are not bishops, which is what we were studying. We were studying, are all elders bishops? No, they're not. But all bishops are elders. All deacons are elders, but not all elders are bishops or deacons. Does that make sense? There are some elders that are just old dudes. Okay. So now to support that as well, now what we have been teaching for years is that in Titus chapter 1 and verse number 5 through 7, is that what Paul is telling Titus is to go ordain elders, and we say that's the pool you fish out of. You don't fish out of the novice pool. You don't get your bishops out of the novice group. You get or the younger group. You get your bishops out of the elder group. And that's because you see the correlation between the word elders there in verse 5 and bishop in verse 7. So the question again, I'm getting back to the start. The question was asked, is Paul saying that these bishops are the elders? Or is he saying to take elders and take some of them elders and make bishops out of them? Because a case can be made for both just in this text I'm saying. Obviously it can't be when you look at the whole study like we've already done and I put it all down on the board. I can make a case here that no, Paul is definitely saying what I've been saying all along, because if you look at verse number 5, for this cause left I thee in Crete, that thou shouldest set in order the things that are wanting, and ordain elders in every city as I had appointed thee. If any be blameless, any what? Bishops? No, because that word hasn't even been introduced yet. If any elders are blameless, let's see. If any be blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of riot or ruling. Because for a bishop must be blameless. So you've got direct evidence here of what we're teaching is true. Ordain elders. And if any of them elders be blameless, if any of them, out of that whole group of elders, if any of them elders are blameless, and they're the husband of one wife, and having faithful children, you can make them bishops, because a bishop must be blameless as a steward of God, not so forth. It wouldn't make any sense in the other case. If it's simply saying ordain bishops, then why would he have to repeat himself? Ordain bishops if they're blameless, because they need to be blameless. That doesn't even make any sense. Because if they're already bishops, they're already bishops. But they're not. They're elders. Here's something that exists before they become bishops. So it supports what we've been teaching all along. But it was worth the study to go through and look at. Because me and Chris stayed here like 2 hours after services last week. I mean, we were here till like 11 o'clock. I think that's right. Yeah, about 11 o'clock. Maybe a little later, going through the rest of these verses. And so that's why when Preacher came home, I asked him, I says, hey, I finished this all right, stopped services sort of halfway through a study, and we were kind of all left hanging as to what's the conclusion here. Because there were certainly some verses that dealt with this idea that all the elders are bishops. But see, now that we've got it all mapped out, now that we've studied all the verses and looked, because we hadn't gotten this far yet to Timothy and Hebrews and Peter, we hadn't gotten that far to see these other definitions clearly laid out in our study as we were walking through it. And so I asked if we could just study that out some more and finish it, because whoever was here last week was going to be left hanging. And we don't like to leave anybody hanging. So we went through it. And so I wanted to put it all up on the board for you to see it. And I'll finish it with this. And then if there's time for other questions, then Pastor Dan can take it from there. But in 1 Timothy chapter 4, we looked at chapter 5. But in 1 Timothy chapter 4, you see right near the end of the chapter where Paul tells Timothy in verse 14, well, verse 13, till I come, give attendance to reading, to exhortation, to doctrine. Neglect not the gift that is in thee, which was given thee by prophecy, with the laying on of the hands of the presbytery. Now, this is the only place in the whole Bible that this word presbytery shows up. And so what is that goofy thing? Presbyteros is the word where it comes from. And it just means the elders. And so if you don't know what the elders are, then you're going to come up with you're going to interpret this differently. See what I'm saying? Now, which elders is it talking about? Is it talking about just the bishops? Is it talking about just the deacons? Is it talking about just the bishops and deacons? Is it talking about just the old dudes? Is it talking about all three? What does it mean? What is a presbytery? What is all that stuff? Well, look what it says. It says, verse 14, neglect not the gift that is in thee, which was given thee by prophecy, with the laying on of the hands of the presbytery. So my mind immediately went to, okay, well, where's some examples of hands being laid on? And let's go to those. Let's go to the anecdotal evidence in the Bible and find out how is this applied. How did they do this? And so it's really pretty simple. Actually, we'll go to 2 Timothy, just a page over because it's chapter 1. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse number 6. You can see that he's writing Timothy again. This is a different epistle. And look what he says in verse 6 of chapter 1. Wherefore I put thee in remembrance that thou stir up the gift of God. See, it's just like he just said, the gift, neglect not the gift, whatever that is. I put thee in remembrance that thou stir up the gift of God, which is in thee by the putting on of my hands. So whoever this presbytery is, the ruler is part of it. Because Paul was part of this presbytery. Because he said the laying on of hands by the presbytery. And then he makes sure you understand he was part of that presbytery in chapter 6. Now if you look at Acts chapter 6, here what we believe are deacons. All that word isn't used, but they're servants. They're servants of the church. That's what a deacon is. In Acts chapter 6, you see that they chose, verse 5, Stephen, they named the 7 guys that were full of the Holy Ghost. Verse 6, whom they set before the apostles, and when they had prayed, they laid their hands on them. Now that was the rulers, which were the apostles at that time, because it was such a new baby church. They hadn't even ordained any bishops yet, really, because they hadn't taught anybody up to that level where they could turn over the church to them. They were still running the church. They were the ones with the oversight of the church of Jerusalem. So here we have an example of just the overseers laying their hands on these guys and ordaining them into the ministry there of a deacon. And then you can go to Acts chapter 13. So far we have a case of a presbytery just being the ruling elders. See, now you know why some churches use that term. I don't know, if you've been around long enough, you'll hear a church say, well, there's the ruling elders, and then there's the elders. Well, that's what they mean by this. There's the ruling elders, and then there's the elders, which is all the old dudes. Then there's the ruling elders, and those are the guys that have the oversight. Okay? We don't really talk about it like that. We just say bishop, we just say pastor, that's all we do. We don't ruling elder. We don't get goofy like the Amish do, or even the Mormons, elder so and so and all that. We just don't call anybody that, so we don't have to use that ruling elders distinction. The distinction's made with pastor. Okay, he's pastor, he's not. He's just an old dude. So we don't have to use those terms. But now you can see why some churches do use those terms, because there is a distinction. But here's another laying on of hands here in Acts chapter 13, because I remembered this here. When Paul was sent off by his local church, in verse number 1 of Acts chapter 13, now there were in the church that was at Antioch certain prophets and teachers, as Barnabas and Simeon that was called Niger, and Lucius of Cyrene, and Manaen, which had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. As they ministered to the Lord and fasted, the Holy Ghost said, separate me, Barnabas and Saul, for the work whereunto I have called them. And when they had fasted and prayed and laid their hands on them, they sent them away. Now, here you got guys that aren't bishops that are laying on of hands. They're prophets and teachers. So, at a minimum, you've got the rulers of the church being the presbytery. The broader scope is brought out here in Acts chapter 13, which includes other elders that aren't bishops. So this is why when we lay hands on people, we call all the men of the church. Because guess what? You can't go wrong that way. You got the bishops, you got the deacons, you got the prophets, you got the teachers, you got the evangelists, you got all the old dudes. You got the whole thing covered. Notice the Bible doesn't restrict who lays hands on. Let me put it to you like this. What if, here's an extreme case, what if everybody in the church laid hands on them? Would the elders still have their hands on them?
Yeah.
It doesn't say anywhere that the elders, and only the elders and none else. It doesn't say that. It just says let the elders, the presbytery, lay hands on them. Well, the presbytery is laying hands on them. Yeah, it just happens to be a couple of other dudes, but it ain't going to hurt nothing. So you can see here what all this stuff is. The authority in the church rests with the bishops, the overseers. Those guys, like in Acts chapter 6, had the power to appoint. Like Acts chapter 15, they had the power to make decrees. They had the power to do that. There's no voting. It's not a congregational type of church government where everything's done democratically and there's votes and all that other kind of stuff. It doesn't work like that. It never worked like that in the Bible. They weren't taking votes. As a matter of fact, every time that people wanted to have votes taken, it went all south, man, in the Old Testament, man. Ask Achan and Corey how that went. Didn't go too good. So the authority rests in the bishops to make decisions and so forth. But the church, just in wisdom, because of the wisdom of the elders, that wisdom should be tapped into. And you see that done in the Bible. You see a guy like, Agabus, there in Acts chapter 20, at the end of is it beginning of chapter 21? The prophet, when he was at Philip's house, and he bound Paul's hands, and let me see here. Yeah, it's chapter 21. Yeah, Agabus. See, this guy Agabus, and God's using that guy to teach Paul some things, to give him some wisdom and some insight into what he's getting himself into. And God will use the elders of the church to help the bishops and dispense wisdom to the bishops. But we went through all this, and it's important because I think if we don't get proper definitions of terms, some can get confused as to what we're actually saying, even though we're using the same terms. Because if you got a different idea of what a term means than I've got, or that Ray's got, or Eric's got, then we're going to get all messed up. So what I'm saying is, you know, the authority lies with the bishops, and that plurality of bishops thing. Okay? The elders of the church are used to give authority to the decisions of the bishops. And Acts chapter 15 bears that out. James issues his decree. The other elders say, awesome. They didn't object. And then the letter went out, not in the name of James, and not just in the name of James and the elders. The whole church consented unto it. The brethren were included. As a matter of fact, let me look at that, how that's termed. It's like at verse number... Yeah. And they wrote letters by them after this manner. The apostles and elders and brethren send greeting unto the brethren which are... The whole church consented to that thing, and it's always wise and good for the elders of the church and the ruling elders, bishops, deacons, whatever, to have the whole church and the men of the church, the brethren, agree. And I believe that's smart, because we know the nature of man, not only because of our own nature, but because of experience. And our experience tells us that, you know, you don't get to complain 2 years later about what we decided when you actually laid hands on the same guy you're complaining about now. See what I'm saying? Because your opportunity to object and all that is past. It's over. You laid hands on him, so you don't get to complain about it. And there's wisdom in that. Because some people, you know, can just complain, you know. That's normal. But I use this Venn diagram. I thought I'd get kind of cool and fancy. To me, that's kind of neat stuff. And then we pointed out these scriptures here that define these classes of elders. And so we easily conclude that all bishops are elders, all deacons are elders, but not all elders are bishops and deacons. Make sense? So when Paul told Titus to ordain elders, he was simply saying, fish out of that pond and find you the elders that are blameless, husband of one wife, having faithful children, and that's who you pick to be your bishops. And it's that simple. So, any questions on any of that? Okay. All right, good. I wanted to finish this. Go ahead.
What is the definition for Presbyterian? I mean, it's great, but what would it
Yeah, the
be?
elders. My computer, I had to send it in to get fixed. I would have been able to look that up really quickly. Let me see what I can do here on my phone. It's a little mini computer here. I know it comes from the word presbyteros, and I believe that just means the elders. But well, I can look it up real quick here. I'll use Webster's 1828 just because that'll be quickest for me right now. And then, let's see here. Search. All right. Presbytery, now, a body of elders in the Christian church. And then you could look at your interlinear. If you've got like Power Bible at home, you could look in your interlinear and go to that word presbyteros there in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 14, and then put your pointer on it, and then a little box will pop up, and it should give you the definition of that term that you would find in an interlinear if you had a handheld one, but on a computer. Now, we don't necessarily like to do that very often. We like to let the Bible define it, but this is the only place it shows up in the Bible, and it's not defined. It just says it. So we almost have no other recourse, but it fits with the context of the thing, because he starts going on later on, and 2 verses later, he starts talking about an elder, rebuke not an elder, and so forth. And why did he all of a sudden he's just like, rebuke not an elder? Because he just got done talking about the elders. laying on the elders. Oh, well, I'm talking about elders. Rebuke not an elder. That's kind of how it happened there. So I guess the next question, the natural progression of things would be, well, when does a person become an elder? Well, I'm not going to answer that one because I don't know. Now, if you forced me to answer that, when I kind of tipped my hat at that last week by saying 30, because of the Old Testament provision in the Bible, for a man to be old enough to be in the ministry, he had to be 30, and then Jesus himself began his ministry at 30. I mean, he was already tripping up the doctors and stuff at 12. God probably could have had, his father probably could have put him in ministry at 20, gotten it over real quick. You know, why wait another 10 years to get started? What's the point? I mean, he's God in the flesh, right? So, why not start him off at 20? Because none of those Jews would have paid him one mind at all. Listen here, you young whippersnapper. You know, who are you to walk around here? You know, he would have had no authority.
He already did it at 30.
Well, at 30 he had authority to the degree where they called him rabbi. I mean, he at least had a legitimate standing as a teacher because he was 30. So if you put a gun to my head and made me say, when does someone become an elder, I would say 30. But then again, at the same time, I'd have to admit to you that it's not a very strong argument because it's all circumstantial. I don't have any direct evidence whatsoever. But that's more evidence I think you'll find for any other age. So while my case is weak, it's probably the strongest one, if that makes sense. But I'd be a fool not to acknowledge that it is still weak. But I believe it would be the strongest argument that one could make. These folks somehow knew. If we were to look at Acts chapter 4 again, and if you looked at verse 5 and verse number 8, this isn't talking about church elders, but verse 5 and verse 8 of Acts chapter 4, it talks about those guys coming against John and Peter. And a distinction is made between the rulers and the elders. So it wasn't a foreign thing. Well, it wouldn't be a foreign thing to the Bible reader, and it wouldn't have been someone that Paul was writing to. It wouldn't have been foreign for the rulers to be a subset of the elders, because a distinction is made between the rulers and elders. If the rulers were the only elders, then why the distinction? So thus you get into the same terms are used once he starts writing to the church. The elders, rulers, the elders that rule well. So to me it's pretty clear now. I mean, clearer now than it's ever been. And that's why I thank Chris for forcing me to think it through completely, word for word for word, all the way through the New Testament. So it was a very fruitful study for me, and for him too. I think he would admit that as well. So I was thankful that he forced me to prove my case, because as I was walking through it, I was conceding some things, and then it swung all the way right back where we started from. But now I can answer this thing solid because we went through it. So, thanks to Chris for that. You cannot deny the scope, the breadth of the scope of the term elder. It's not that narrow.
Right.
It's a little bit broader than that. And you have to understand that, because when the Bible has a context where it doesn't say or define which type of elder, it could be any of them, and it would fulfill that. So when it says, call the elders of the church, it doesn't necessarily have to be Brother Dave and Brother Dan and Brother Keith. It could be, someone who lives close by, like Brother Ray and Brother Eric. Maybe DJ's sick or something. You guys live up there. Call it, brother, you two go on over to the elders of the church. Come over, lay hands on you, and lay hands with oil. Not a problem. But if your scope is this narrow on the term elder, well, guess what? It can only be, Dan, Keith, and Dave. So there are consequences to your definitions. It changes things. So it was good to have, for me anyway, I don't know if it was good for anybody else, but it was good for me to walk through this thing verse by verse all the way through starting at the book of Acts at least, to deal with the definition of elders in the church. What is that? And were we teaching something not to its fullest? Because my teaching out of Titus 1 would have been incomplete. Wouldn't have been erroneous, but it would have been incomplete or too broad in my explanation if, in fact, the scope of elders was only this small. We wouldn't have been wrong, but we would have certainly been incomplete. And then, therefore, vague or ambiguous. But now that we've looked at all the verses, no, we're spot on all along anyway. We were spot on all along anyway. It's all right. I don't have anything more to say about that. I think we exhausted that subject. So almost. Well, you're going to add something, I'm sure. And then you've got this text out of 1 Peter Sunday, so I'm sure it's going to fit right in there.
Have you got this mic on here, son?
Here, I'll give
Because this one on there, it's okay, it's on. Okay, I'll just show you a couple verses there real quick when Brenda hit on that Presbyterian.
Yeah.
First, Presbyterian.
Okay, so it's private.
See? All the estate of the elders. So what's Paul saying here? Also, the high priest doth bear me witness, and all the estate of the elders, from whom also I received letters unto the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring them which were there bound unto Jerusalem for to be punished. Now, as sure as Moses had elders that hated him, and as sure as
Right.
God says he's got 24 elders around the throne.
Right.
Now, who do you think made that position? Isn't that interesting that God would have 24 elders there in heaven?
That's true. Yeah.
Double 12.
Yeah, I saw that today.
24 elders. Isn't that interesting? So, if we were to back up a little bit, look who Paul's talking to, too. Notice when he's addressing these people here. In verse 22, verse 1, chapter 22, verse 1, you see Paul's defense here. He says, men, brethren, and notice, fathers.
Right.
Fathers, hear ye my defense, which I make now unto you. And so then he appeals to their good sense and know that, look, I was just doing my job. And I even had the approval of all the estate of the elders, verse 5. From whom also I received letters unto the brethren, went to Damascus to bring them which were there bound into Jerusalem for to be punished. So this is where the word is used. Again, you see that principle. Because again, this is a principle that
Right.
we've picked up from Israel, no doubt. The church in the wilderness, now we're the New Testament church of the Lord Jesus Christ. And this is one of the terms that is used in the New Testament church. We see it in the life of Jesus. Let's look at, I think it's Luke 22:66. Luke 22:66. Luke 22:66, and as soon as it was day, the elders of the people and the chief priests
Right.
and the scribes came together and led him into their council, saying, art thou the Christ? Tell us. There it is again in that Jewish sense, see,
Right.
that Jewish general manner of wording. As soon as it was day, the elders of the people and the chief priests and the scribes came together and led him into their council, saying, And so, and then the word for council, what's that Greek word for council there? Sanhedrin. I mean, you can't miss it. So it's a popular usage, and of course, like Dave said, and they definitely knew, they understood what was being connoted with that word elder. But today, you know, we're living in America where people are so dumbed down, they think that it's unpatriotic to stand up for the Second Amendment. I mean, this day we're living in, this is an insane asylum run by the inmates, man. This is so bizarre.
Well, and youth here is idolized
Yeah,
in this society.
exactly. Well said.
Instead of
That's
elders.
exactly, the wisdom of the elders, yeah.
Right.
And it's not honored, it's not a place of honor.
No.
And so that's a good point.